So this is the last session, and we've entitled it Bringing It Together, and that's always the challenge. You've just heard throughout the day how the system, the electricity system in particular, and the energy system more generally, is in a time of fundamental transition and transformation. And we haven't talked at all really about transport. We've alluded to gas. But on the transport side, we've really didn't focus on that today at all. But there's plenty of transition in the transport side as well. You've heard from three of the panellists already today. The one you haven't heard from is Michael Brear, who's the director of the Melbourne Energy Institute. In terms of bringing it together, Mike, I'm going to start with you. Tell me a little bit about. You should perhaps talk a little bit about the institute and just tell them what you do. You're one of our key sponsors, but also maybe you could start the discussion on. Yeah, okay. So how does all this begin to bring together from where you guys see it?
Well, thank you. And can everybody hear me? Yep. Well, first thing, David, thank you for the opportunity to sponsor the event. It's been terrific. And I'm the director of the MEI. I've been in the job for about a year. Many of you will know Mike Sanderford, who was my predecessor and who established the Institute, I think 7 or so years ago. It's a terrific opportunity to take over from Mike. Where are we at bringing it all together? Yeah. Wow. Well, first things first, MEI, Melbourne Uni is a big university, we know, and we do a lot of different stuff, social sciences, economics, law, even engineering and science. I'm an engineer. Unreconstructed, proud engineer. Well, hopefully maybe a little bit reconstructed, Chloe, but proud nonetheless. So we do a lot of different stuff from looking at impacts on communities, impacts on the environment, understanding the subsurface in terms of what we take out and what we put in, but also energy technologies and particularly energy systems. Mm-hmm. So MEI was commissioned by the Finkel review panel. Chloe was one of 5 panellists, is that correct?
4 plus Alan.
Yes, and plus Alan. Okay, gotcha. And we worked very hard, almost as hard as the review panel.
Certainly is.
And we were commissioned, and Yvonne mentioned our new professor of power systems engineering, Professor Pierluigi Mancarella, was asked to take the Jacobs portfolios going into the future and determine in particular, the frequency response adequacy, the ability of the system to maintain 50 hertz in these renewable-rich scenarios, of which there were numerous. And Chloe has already gone through a lot of those recommendations, as has Yvonne. So I would just like to say, now that that's happened, and it was a wonderful process to behold and be part of, it really was quite a remarkable thing. And really, we are very proud to have participated, and we hope we did a good job. But looking back from all that, looking back at today's discussion, the need for policy certainty, the need for planning, I do think that there is a need for strong independent planning. That's my personal view. And I don't think that fundamentally conflicts with a market-based approach. I think if you do it properly, it actually encourages competition, where competition can lead to good outcomes, and it can avoid some of the more perverse aspects of competition where there's inherently strong natural monopolies that are deeply problematic to overcome. But policy certainty, independent planning, then of course redesign of our wholesale market in particular are the 3 things we need to do. And in so doing, I always find myself going back to the fundamentals. Now, in my area, of course, that's the technical fundamentals. I'm a mechanical engineer. I study gas turbines and reciprocating engines and those things, but the fundamentals of the power system as well, but also the fundamentals of the microeconomics in wholesale markets, and also the fundamentals of financial markets and futures and securities and all these other things. So I question whether or not we need to reinvent a lot of the fundamentals. We just need to stick to them, reinterpret them for the 21st century, and then let technologies dance and mix and complement and win and lose on the basis of good technical, microeconomic and financial market fundamentals. And just finally on that, and I'll move on to my colleagues, part of that is I think we do need to meditate a bit on mechanical inertia, which is my area, mechanical engineering, but and think about what is it and what isn't it, and what is it needed, and when is it not needed? Because there are some very fundamental respects in which a spinning piece of metal has some inherent properties that are very, very hard for any computer-controlled device to ever beat. If you try and slow down a spinning piece of metal instantaneously, you require an infinite amount of power to do so. That's the theory. And so I question any inverter, any bit of power electronics, any bit of computer with inherent processing times and delays to always provide that service in all instances as well as a spinning piece of metal. It can provide lots of them, and there's great opportunities around the South Australian battery and the Hayward and how they can complement one another, but mechanical inertia is an important thing. And thank you also, David, for mentioning the event tomorrow night on pumped hydro, and we'll see you there tomorrow night. So that's me done.
So in terms of, I'm thinking back, and I was having a brief conversation with a colleague of mine, Jerry Morvell, who was in the Australian Greenhouse Office many years ago, and we, in the mid-2000s, I was doing some work for the AGO and did a lot of work for the Victorian government, and you kind of look at it and think, well, a lot of this was foreseeable in many ways. A lot of the mess we're actually in was actually pretty foreseeable, and the technology, and yet the regulators didn't see it. The politicians sort of did. They said, oh well, look, we'll give you a feed-in tariff, and lo and behold, people responded and put PV on their roofs. It's amazing. It'll only be 50 megawatts and 1,000 megawatts of PV later. I think we should cut that off because it's getting a little expensive. So I sort of put it to the panel. Did the consumers run ahead of the technology? Did the technology pull the consumers? Who created it seems like a foreseeable mess, and yet here we are. And where to from here, bringing it together? Chloe, I'll start with you.
Yeah, well, as you can imagine, I've pondered this question for a long time, and not just in the energy sector, because it's always seemed to me, if you actually look at what happens in the economy, I mean, here we are talking about a system that needs to respond in microseconds. Well, there is no question in my mind that consumers, not en masse, but with a kind of wave, consumers in the community move fastest, business comes next, and government is behind. And the more complicated the institutional arrangements are, the harder it is for government to respond. And I think, one of the tragedies of energy, and it's there's no point kind of going into a blame thing, this is just the reality here, that there were good public policy reasons to have a division of labour between the institutions. There's the complexity that we have of our federation, which is quite different from a governance point of view from any other federation that I've encountered. And it meant that actually a lot of people did know exactly what was likely to happen. And they could see the bits of it, but it wasn't their responsibility to deal with it. And they kind of thought that the system as a whole somehow would respond to that. And of course it didn't, because there is massive inertia in the system. So it's... So once you've got that question, then that observation, then the question is, well, what is the solution? So the solution that we talk about in Finkel, of course, is people looked at it and said, well, you're just trying to put in another layer of governance. How can that be good? But it was really trying to get more of a program office approach, and also saying, well, if you get better focus on outcomes rather than process and inputs, and more how can you get more accountability so that, and this has been a beef of mine ever since I first came to Australia 21 years ago, that regulators are not held to account for the outcomes. They're held to account for the processes they run. But if you ask the ACCC, well, all the choices you've made, has that really been good for the Australian economy? And is the economy more competitive than it would otherwise have been because of the actions you've chosen to take? That is not something they're held to account for. So this is in a small way trying to do that by getting better information to the decision makers about, well, how is the system as a whole performing? And then the institutions who are governing it really have to be jointly and severally accountable for that. They've still got distinct responsibilities. You don't want a whole sort of mess where everybody's doing everybody else's job. But collectively, there is a collective accountability here. So I don't know how much that's going to solve it, but trying to find ways where you can be a bit fleeter of foot. So the initiative that Audrey Zibelman's taken with AEMO to set up the expert panel, which I'm chairing, is also an attempt to try and speed up that process a bit. So we get engagement with industry, people who actually know what they're talking about and what the impact of various kinds of interventions would be, involved earlier in the design process. And hopefully that'll mean that we don't get into so many backwaters and it's a bit more purposeful. We'll see. But at least there's a bit of experimentation going on.
I was just thinking I'd probably cut the policymakers a bit of slack around this problem we've got around variability. If I think about myself personally, as a forecaster, if, before 2010, maybe even before 2012, if you had included solar PV as a big part of decarbonisation in Australia, you would have been a laughingstock.
Yeah.
It was really expensive. It just didn't look like it was going to be a big part of the solution at all.
Yep.
And the only reason why we're now thinking about how do we run a low inertia electricity system is just because we've been totally surprised by low inertia technologies being what looks like the cheapest stuff to build.
Having said that, Paul, I've seen papers written in 2007 about this in connection with wind. I agree with you about solar.
Yeah.
But certainly the wind issue in South Australia was well understood a decade ago.
Yeah. But I think, look at it from this perspective, last year was the first year that AEMO included storage as a technology in their forecast, because we didn't think we'd have to use these things until recently. We thought we'd have some wind, but the rest of the system would be some kind of spinning technology. It'd be CCS or something else. Of course, we'd have wind and we'd have maybe some solar thermal, but we just didn't expect. Most of the solutions that we're running now are just heading towards as much solar, PV and wind as you can get in there, and whatever you need to build around it to make it work when you're looking at projections work. And that's been a shift just in the last 2 years that I've noticed.
Tony, how much have we simply been a taker of PV and wind in a global sense, and how much are we going to be a taker of all of the technologies, the digital side, this bringing together of really what's happening is we've got to bring together the power industry with the communications industry with the IT industry, if this is all going to sort of come together in a technical sense, don't we?
Well, Australia has a record of being pretty early adopters.
Yes.
But of course, in this area of particularly PV, as Rosemary puts a slide up today that showed that the biggest issue people had for adopting PV was to have cheaper power.
Correct.
Not too many of them weren't prepared to admit that the money was coming from the next door neighbour who didn't have the PV.
Yes.
And so we've had this, in energy, we've got this incredibly integrated set of issues. I work at Grattan, the Policy Institute. We have people who work on health, education, transport, cities, budgets. None of them has the same issue of a combination of financial, physical and political challenges. And this is, you could argue right now that a lot of the debate is actually nothing to do with energy. It's a proxy for a different political battle going on inside the coalition government, right?
True.
But that's the reality of the world. And so, that's where we are at the moment. So when you get me on a pessimistic day, Bruce, I'd say, look, I think this is all going to go to hell in a handbasket.
Yep.
We are going to have, the lights are going to go out somewhere in this country and governments are going to take over.
Yep.
It's going to be something nasty is going to happen, right? Big thermal generator goes over, and you only have to look at the combination of circumstances that AEMO says this could happen and say, oh shit.
Yep.
Right? Now, on the optimistic day, which will be tomorrow, there is a way out of this, right? I mean, when you look at, I think you look at what the government's doing, and they surely can't have any more reviews.
Surely.
They must have got to the end of the review process. Right? I mean, we've had,
Chloe, are you that optimistic?
I think the last one we did has a bit of longevity in it.
yeah, but I mean, Alan, your review is a review of reviews.
It was.
Part of it, right? And there's a piece I've written for the Financial Review tomorrow which talks about all these reviews, right? And some of them are now all coming together. Now, hopefully, there's nothing else to be reviewed. So, by the time we have the ACCC review to be delivered this week, the preliminary report on the retail market, we had AEMO, we had all the Finkel review and so forth and so on. We've got all these reviews. Together, when you put them all together, the pieces are all there. The pieces are there for the governments to pick up. And one of the things that I think is, we see some very, very unedifying shirt fronting going on between Josh Frydenberg and Jay Weatherall, or between Joel Fitzgibbon and Joel Frydenberg every time. I don't think he's a natural shirt fronter, by the way. But I think when you look at the way he actually handles the COAG Energy Council, they actually tend to do work, and they do agree on stuff. Right? So if they could just start to stop blaming each other for a little bit, that'll never stop completely, because we do have a parochial federal system. Then we might be getting to see how you could put together that combination of, because the Finkel review didn't cover everything, it never was intended to. What was recommended in there, together with the dispatchability issues that have come out of AEMO, which integrates with the Finkel review, takes it a bit further. I think that there is definitely a way forward through the clean energy target. It may not be called that. It will be called something really ugly, or the really ugly energy target, maybe. I don't know. But something that is not obviously subsidising renewable energy, because that's obviously bad, and doesn't rule out coal, would start maybe enough for at least a majority of people in the coalition party. Then you can start to see the beginnings of where we might head. It doesn't mean there's some non-trivial issues, many of which have been aired here today. Yep. But I think then you can start to see a way through this. And I think we are very close to seeing something that could look like that.
Questions, comments, please? Yes, Ivan? There's a microphone coming.
Oh, sorry. One of the things we haven't talked about today is, I think, that we did mention it, the market actually is shrinking. And it's always very difficult in a shrinking market to invest significantly. What if we could turn that around and make it actually a growing market? And I'm thinking about one potential here, and I would like to comment of the panel. What about electrification of transport? Can it actually help us to reverse that trend and see a growing electricity market with growing investments?
Yeah, so
Paul,
I've probably run about 1 million electric vehicle projections in the last 15 years, let's say. It doesn't turn out to be a huge bonanza. It's sort of 10 to 20%. So the last ones we ran, it saves a flat outlook. It adds a little bit of slope, but it's not going to double electricity demand or anything like that. Probably the bigger action is whether you electrify some industrial processes down the track. So yeah, it's something, but it's not going to get us back to 2% growth like historically. Yeah.
Okay. Hugh? Oh, sorry, Michael, do you have a comment?
Just on that, roughly speaking, the amount of joules of liquid fuels we burn in cars and buses and everything else on the road is about the same number of joules as we do consume in electricity. But the 10 to 20% is because an electric vehicle is 7 times more efficient or something than a conventional car, or whatever it is, 4 or 5 times. But however, the substitution of maybe making hydrogen from electricity and using that, and then using that to provide demand response services inside a wind farm and all these other dynamic interplays, I think is a very interesting thing, because you've got curtailed wind, which has zero value because a wind farm can't sell it because it's curtailed, generating hydrogen instead, and you pipe that hydrogen off and turn that into gasoline, because crude oil plants, refineries are big consumers of hydrogen, which they currently get from natural gas, for example. So I'm not even saying fuel cell vehicles. So I think there is lots of opportunity for interplay. EVs, plug-in hybrids, and even conventional cars running on synthetic fuels and liquid fuels. Absolutely. Anyway, sorry, Hugh.
Can I ask a really simple question? If you removed all subsidies from renewables and let everyone burn all the rubbish they wanted to, would it lower the price of electricity?
Immediately, yes. In the longer term, probably not.
How long a term?
Well, because when you start replacing stuff, right? So a new coal-fired power station is going to cost about the same as sort of large-scale wind and solar today, even with firming, right? Now, it's not... The honest answer to the second part is no one really knows yet as to how this storage issue is going to play out. So, you know, I think that people have raised this question in the policy sense. That was that whole debate that people may have heard about, where the government was toying seriously, and may still, who knows, come back to, the idea that, well, once you set an emissions threshold, everything below that gets a credit per megawatt hour. That would be technology neutral. The problem with that is that it doesn't achieve your emission standards. So to do what you're saying, you've got to ignore climate change, so we're just not going to bother. Because solar and wind at the moment is not sufficiently competitive, and because we don't need any more stuff, the existing kit will stay for so long we won't meet our targets.
It might lower the price, but not the cost.
Sorry, I'm not advocating this, but I'm trying to address the political argument that's going on, which seems to me mind-bogglingly stupid. But if what you're saying is correct, then it proves it's stupid.
Chloe?
Yeah, well, I think the thing is, I mean, it's always about the transition, and so the first thing is definitely that it does. You know, if you're running clapped out old plant, and you basically run it to fail, and you'll lose reliability, and all of that because it'll get more and more unreliable. The unit price of your dispatched energy, yes, that'll be lower, but the cost will be higher because you'll get into more of these risks around that, and of course the cost to the atmosphere and ultimately the planet will be something you don't want to know about. So, but also it's quite clear that the community actually doesn't want that. And the transition is partly happening because people are actually making, even though they're totally uneconomic and mad, are making these investment decisions and they want to behave differently. So there's quite a pull-through happening. And can I tell you a story about my friend Brian? Do I have time to tell the whole story? So Brian is the man who used to drive me to the airport. He was a retired taxi driver and he drove this sort of 1980s Merc. And his wife was a disability pensioner. And he decided to put solar panels on his roof. No, not of the Merc, on his home. And we had a long conversation about this. He didn't really know what I did for a living at the time, and I wasn't going to tell him. But so eventually he persuaded his wife it was worth sinking his savings into this. And Brian used to go and stand in his garden and watch the meter to work out when to put, to Jill's point, to fire up the bath that his wife used to use so that the hot water would be nice and warm for when she got into it, and they had a very well insulated cover, and he worked out he should do that in the middle of the day. Brilliant. He had to do that all on his own. But the fact was, you know, there he is, somebody who you'd think is going to be left behind by all of this, still wanting to be part of that space because it made sense to him on a lot of fronts. So, you know, I just think that actually the option that you talk about, which is kind of running all the clapped out old stuff till it all falls over and we don't have good services, it's just not one that anybody's going to contemplate. And one way or the other, people will make some investment. It's just it's not going to be the most efficient set of investments, but I think it will happen.
Okay. Further questions? Snow first.
Yeah. It's not really the question, Tony. You should call it the energy emissions target. That would really set them going. But the real question is what you were just talking about, Chloe, is we've skirted around in this connection between having a national energy plan and who is responsible for that, given that energy has been with states for a long time, but it's clearly now federal. But environment is really federal in terms of if you're talking about emissions. So is there any alternative to having this? Clearly the nation wants to join together energy and emissions, and as you've just said, if the nation hasn't, the populace has. So what is the way to bust through this imbroglio that we have? And, you know, is it regulation? Because, you know, if you look at the Californian situations, they've been quite, you know, courageous of just saying old clunkers are out and old rattlers in terms of air conditioners are out. And they have achieved a lot of energy efficient demand of savings out of that. So you know, basically within this room we've had shitload, but are we just gutless in the terms of policy?
We've got two things in our system which are somewhat, I wouldn't say unique, but are somewhat unusual. One, and Chloe's referred to this already, Alan refers to it every time he gives the presentation, is the governance structure for our energy system is maybe unique, where we have this Coa Energy Council conflicted all over the place. I mean, it is dysfunctional. It cannot do what it's supposed to do. It cannot. And that makes it hard, right? Because all they do is they sort of muddle through with some goodwill, but every now and again the goodwill goes away and they break off and do some dumb things. And they can't stop themselves because it's the nature of the beast, right? Yeah, I do it because I have to. So the other side of it is we do have an unusual physical situation. Right? There's not many parts of the world where you've got a small number of middle-sized cities on a global basis connected by very large transmission lines, which pretends it's a national system and sometimes behaves like that and sometimes doesn't. The cost of transmission, which is absolutely part of the European solution to some of this, is just prohibitive in this country to build as much transmission as they're building relatively. And we've got that very different that challenge for us from a physical system, and we're coming from a very high emissions per capita base anyway. So we've got to do this on our own, and no one else is going to help us do it. And I think they're significant challenges. That's why this afternoon is my pessimistic day.
But isn't that a good reason to have a plan?
No, but I don't see how you can. The problem is imposing is having someone buy the plan. Yeah. Because I think Alan's done. The thing that Alan and the panel have done, the enormous contribution, wasn't necessarily, in my view, anything specifically which could be trademarked. It was bringing it all together and saying, here is an overall plan, a blueprint, right? And they've talked about the blueprint, and we're going to adopt this blueprint. The Energy Security Board has been established to implement the blueprint. And yet, the week this was announced, the Queensland government said, we're going to set up a panel to implement the Finkel recommendations, the ones we agree with.
Yeah.
And so
Quick comment,
it's
Mike?
tricky.
We are different. I mean, I think this is actually can't be overstated, that how different Australia is in terms of our electricity systems. Many years ago I used to have conversations with people who say, oh, well, we just need to do what Europe does. Almost despair. It means you know nothing about Europe versus Australia. And you cannot just import a bunch of solutions that work over there and say, let's do it here. We really are that different.
I've got no idea how the European transnational market actually functions. So, and I don't think my friends who work in it full time don't understand it either. So I would be hesitant to import the European EU model to Australia. An optimistic view is, I don't know how different we actually are. This state is the only state in Australia where we separate transmission planning from transmission ownership. That's commonly done right across the United States. This state has significantly cheaper transmission network costs than all the other states. And that's interesting, that those who own and operate the transmission network don't get to decide how much transmission network gets built. And it turns out that it's cheaper in this state than it is in other states. And it's commonly done in the United States by a not-for-profit independent planner. So there's lots of evidence of good things being done in other markets, and I particularly like the way Americans do a lot of things. Strong regulation, separation of planning from operation, and then I think a lot more of the latest innovation in the way wholesale markets operate as well. So there is a lot of good examples of the way things can function, and I think that we should look at those very seriously.
Okay, Jerry?
Jerry Morvell from BCIA. During the day we heard, I think the figure's right, 21,000 megawatts of new renewables coming on, or proposed I should say. John touched on something which has been circulating for a long time, that is, if the wind is blowing there and not there, that's fine because you just have a wind farm in each place and it'll balance out. So you build capacity far more than you actually need. 21,000 megawatts of renewables coming on, potentially. In the short term, that's probably not a problem because there's capacity there, and we will lose Liddell in the next few years, and maybe a few other things will change. I wonder in the medium to longer term, are we creating, perhaps it's the next target for a review, and that is we have oversupplied, and then we get into the problem that the auto industry got into here, where they just go to the government and ask for more subsidies to keep going because you've got so much supply sitting there unused, because you've had to build 3 wind farms because you've got a 33% capacity factor. You build 3 wind farms, and then each of them want to maximise their return. Can the system cope with that, or is it a future problem, or is it just something we don't worry about because the market will sort them out? In other words, some will just fall over.
Well, if I can comment on that, first of all, I don't think it'll happen like that because investors are just too leery of it. And I think I think somebody commented today that already you can see, we had this huge hiatus in investment in renewables after the Warburton review was announced that went on, and then this very long period while the government tried to work out what it wanted to do and then tried to negotiate a bipartisan deal, which eventually it did, but it was a very drawn-out process, and it took about a year after that for investors to start coming back to the market. The RET isn't full yet, but it will be by the beginning of next year. So I think that will slow down, and a lot of that just won't be financed. But of course, it's true. For a long time, and I used to say this all the time in forums like this, the wholesale price of electricity now is the same as it was when I came in 1996 and we were privatising it all, and it just nobody was. I can tell you the prices that all the investors paid to buy those assets wasn't based on the wholesale market looking like that for so long. But prices did rise, as you saw in one of the charts, and then some new investment came into the market, and then there was a correction, and then the new investment stopped. So the market was actually quite good at that, but now that price signal doesn't work in the same way. So I think a bit of redesign there can address that. And the real question is, does there need to be some sort of capacity mechanism? And that would, I think, help kind of moderate that. And that's the discussion that's very live now. So I wouldn't. I think it's quite an unlikely scenario that we'd end up with, unless there's some real surprises on the demand side, which of course is possible, that we would end up with so much overinvestment that everything's limping along. I mean, I just think the scenarios that investors are working to means that we're more likely to have risk on the other side at the moment, at least. But wiser people may disagree.
I think one of the reasons my optimistic hat on earlier is that we may have seen the end of really dumb policies. There's an optimistic statement.
We have seen the end of policy. I mean,
state governments eventually realised that feed-in tariffs were really dumb. Not all of them. Some of them are now doing it. They call them PPAs. Then you have the renewable energy targets, which the renewable energy target nationally, which is also really dumb as a climate policy, and not even dumber as an energy policy. Great industrial policy, by the way. That's why the renewable energy industry likes it. But what it did, of course, as we know very clearly, and what resulted in that. But I think when you get to the end of it, right, and now we may be getting to the end of it if they leave it alone, which they've sort of said they will, and we'll see. But what will happen now is that, as Chloe said, a lot of that stuff, which is being driven by the RET, will not go ahead, or it will be met, and then there'll be the LGC price will basically disappear to zero. Then what does replace it? And so how do you then think about the sort of combination of technologies if we don't have what we might have, what we might not have? And I think, Jerry, then you end up with this debate that Chloe's referred to already. We wrote a report about this just fairly recently. Will the market contract? When you forget about renewable energy, think about zero marginal cost energy. It's as important as growth is. Zero marginal cost in a whole range of things across our society is fundamentally tipping up a whole lot of things in the air. I mean, communication, entertainment, the way we pay for stuff when the marginal cost is zero is really interesting. Energy is going the same way. And what is that going to mean for the way we pay for stuff? Because after you've built the thing, the energy is free. Really, it sounds simple, but it challenges so much of the way this is going to evolve. And so, what that means is if you've got a whole lot of fixed cost stuff, the traditional way to get money for that is to have a contract. Now, up until now, we've tended to have hedge contracts which protect retailers and generators from really high prices. A lot of that liquidity in that market's gone, so they're having trouble contracting. PPAs under the RET are going. So will that market re-emerge and therefore fix the problem, as you said was one alternative, or will there be a need to have the government intervene in some way, shape or form? The AEMO report on dispatchable capability, the one that was produced very recently, gets into that space.
David, last question.
Partly a statement, partly a question. About a decade ago, Paul wrote a report, and one of the conclusions on it was looking at the cost of energy services in the future against the cost of or the value of our wealth, or against our wealth. And at that time, it showed, if I recall correctly, that in fact energy services were getting cheaper because our wealth was increasing at a greater rate. Now, I wonder whether we should be looking at that as well in the longer term. I mean, if the marginal cost of electricity is zero, if someone's got to pay for the capital and all that sort of thing, and we've had some major hiccups, increases in value or cost in the last year or so, and there are people in the economy that is really hurting, and we've got to take care of them. But overall, I would like to see us try and estimate whether our energy services are in fact increasing compared to our wealth or decreasing. That is, can we afford more energy services now with our income or with our wealth, as a function of our wealth, than we could in the past? I think it would be a very interesting sort of study to do.
Well, we know the answer to that question, David. It's been pretty stable at about 2.4% of income. So you can extrapolate what that means in terms of wealth, but it's the distributional effects that are troubling. So for lower income households, it's a much higher proportion, and it's been rising. So for a lot of us, we're really pretty indifferent because we don't notice it. And the question is really whether it can evolve into, as mobile phones and broadband and all of those, where they're becoming pretty essential services. I mean, if you're a homeless person, the most important thing you can have is a mobile phone service. And so is there an affordable mobile phone service that somebody who's in that situation can have? And the answer is yes, there is. Because there's some very cheap plans out there. Now, can we do the same thing in energy is really the question.
Paul? Yeah, one of the...
Grattan Institute, somebody made the point, and I haven't really thought about it in these terms, but in fact, our energy, most household energy costs are about 2 cups of tea. People in this room, that probably doesn't matter. But it does say that our energy, historically about energy costs, quite as draconian as most people about those.
So I think two things have changed since that original observation. One is that we've had really bad wages growth, and I think that's changed people's attitudes about how much they're willing to cop increases in essential services. The second thing is you can hedge now against the retail price of electricity. You can put solar on, and that locks in, for some people that could be up to 50%. That locks in 50% of their electricity costs for maybe 20 years. That's pretty good, because I'm pretty confident electricity prices are going up. So on the one hand, we've got bad news on wages. On the other hand, at least residential customers in separate dwellings have got a lot more control over their exposure to electricity price increases. So it's much more mixed bag now. If you try to even describe how people are impacted, you've really got to break up and segment everyone. It's really hard to generalise now because it's very different for customers now. You can't talk about one customer.
The AEMC has several times attempted to come to a number on how we value electricity. And when you look at the way they do it, it is so weird that you'd have to say don't even bother. Because they do the sort of thing that, they ask people what do they think, right? And usually it's, well, I value electricity a lot more the last time I had to throw out all the contents of my refrigerator or whatever, right? But what is true, I think, is that, and you only need to see what happened in South Australia, the things that a reliable source of electricity underpins are so pervasive across our economy. My suspicion is that the real value to our overall well-being, for the vast majority of it, it far exceeds the actual cost. And for most of the people in this room, if the electricity price went up by 100%, we still pay it. Because there's something, and you think about the things that we use electricity for, and you only have to see what happened inside the individual stories. The infamous one of the IVF clinic that all the embryos thawed out and all that sort of stuff, to realise just how electricity underpins our economy. And I think you're right. And where that leads us in terms of thinking about policy, because the reality is you've got two funny things going on. One is everybody thinks electricity is their biggest. 81% of consumers, according to Choice, reckon electricity is the biggest household problem they've got, more than mortgages, more than health. And yet, 50% of them don't bother to go and get a better deal.
Yep.
It just, and that includes me.
And me.
I think you're right. There's that question about how much are we overreacting to everything. I think because in theory, okay, we've got most of the Finkel review recommendations taken on board. We've got a climate review going at the moment. That'll report and tell us what our climate policy is. We've got the ESB set up. We've got AEMO clearly working on the things that they need to work on. So, in theory, it's all kind of happening, right? But I think it's more to the fact that us as professionals are dealing with new things that we just haven't had to do enough. We haven't done enough analysis on them yet. So, Ivan talking about, we don't really know how quickly we can communicate with these things. So I think all of us as professionals know all the answers aren't even there. And at the same time, everything that's happening on a professional level is sitting there on top of a political discourse, which we know is disconnected from everything that we look at and discuss in forums like this, which is fine. So in the political world, you get very black and white statements that we know, we would never countenance. But I think that's the challenge, and the challenge is that's the world that investors see. So investors are standing back from all of this. And so I think the risk is that can all of those government processes move fast enough to give investors confidence to be able to get things moving in time to avoid, the next thing that could trigger a response that we don't want to see. Yeah.
All right. In that, I'm going to wrap it up for today. Firstly, I would like to thank you all for coming. I hope it has been an informative day for you, an interesting day for you, and a day in which you have learned something, at least one thing that you didn't know before. Certainly I know I did. I'd also like to thank the ATSE staff again who are here to make it run for us. Sue Wickham, Dominic Banfield, Katja Wilmot and Sarah Hayward. Thank you for your support. And finally, if I could ask you all to thank the panel, Paul, Tony, Chloe and Michael. I think it's been a really good day, very useful day. Bringing it together, it's hard to bring something together that is in a period of rapid change and rapid transition. In 2030, we'll be able to look back and say, oh, okay, so that's how it all came together. But we can't see it right at the moment. All we can do is kind of look and say, well, there are all these potential pathways. But we are, there's more clarity there. I think among the professionals, perhaps there's more clarity. I'm not sure at the political level quite yet, but we are getting there. Anyway, panellists, thank you very much.